Podcast downloads are up. The latest from podnews.net with Magellan AI, now analysing Spanish podcasts. Podcast downloads increased by 20% last year, says Triton Digital in the company's first US year-end podcast report. Listeners downloaded 5.6 episodes a week on average, representing 3.8 hours of content. Podcasts are doing just fine, says Acast's Podchaser. While the biggest players in the podcast industry have expanded and contracted wildly over the past few years, it says the podcasting middle class has quietly and consistently grown. Yesterday, we highlighted that the 80% drop in new podcast headlines were wide of the mark. The fast-growing Everything Everywhere Daily podcast hosted by Gary Arndt has been acquired by Glassbox Media. That brings Glassbox's listenership to over 10 million downloads a month. City University of London has announced the UK's first dedicated MA in podcasting and a Centre of Podcasting Excellence. Students will be taught by podcast professionals who've worked at The Guardian, the BBC, Bauer Media, The New York Times and 6foot6 Productions. The full schedule for Podcast Movement Evolutions is now live. The event is in Las Vegas in early March. Meanwhile, the Podcast Show 2023 in London is selling passes at an early bird price, saving 35% for May's event. Podcast hosting company Blueberry has released support for Value, a way to accept online payments from podcast listeners in apps like Fountain, Castamatic and Podverse. The company has partnered with Alby. With more than 100,000 shows using Blueberry, this is the biggest podcast host so far to natively support Value. The company will release further support for the new podcast namespace next week. Behind a paywall, The Information posts an article about Patreon, used by many podcasters, including us, for support. All is not well, the article suggests. Bits of it are readable via the author's Twitter. Pinecast founder Matt Basta writes a piece accusing Apple Podcasts of trapping creators, based on one podcaster who apparently used Apple Podcasts as a hosting platform. Edison Research has highlighted the most efficient podcasts in different regions of the US, and thinking of tweeting an affiliate link or some kind of paid partnership, an email tells us now that Twitter's updated rules require you to add a hashtag. In People News, Mike Joachim is no longer working in senior sales at Supporting Cast and is looking for a new role in sales in the podcasting industry. If you've been affected by recent changes in the job market, we'd love to sing your praises to more than 25,000 subscribers. You can email editor@podnews.net with an updated LinkedIn link and tell us what kind of role you're looking for. And in podcast news, Latina to Latina is celebrating reaching 2 million downloads. Only 2% of general contractors in the construction business are women. Girl Flip is a new podcast launching today with entrepreneur Erica Annenberg, which highlights the stories of influential women in traditional male roles. What happens when the watchdog tasked with overseeing the most powerful law enforcement agency in the US doesn't do its job? Bad Watchdog is new today from the Project on Government Oversight. Almost everyone who's taken a vacation or trip knows that things don't always go exactly as planned. In Welcome to Paradise, It Sucks, Andrew Tate interviews real people about their harrowing vacation stories. It's new today. Also new today, The War on Drugs, launched by Lava for Good podcasts. The podcast examines the true cost of 5 decades on the failed US war on drugs. And there's more in our show notes and our newsletter today. This podcast is sponsored by Magellan AI. Magellan AI has added support for analysing Spanish-language podcasts in the US and Mexico. The product is already monitoring more than 2,000 advertisers. You can get a demo at magellan.ai/Spanish. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.